Hey everybody, welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be looking at something pretty heavy, and it's a big topic, anti-Blackness. And we've got this blog post here called Unmasking Everyday Anti-Blackness, and we're really going to try to unpack what it is, why it's so persistent, and how it shows up in ways that maybe we don't always even realize. So are you ready to kind of explore this with me?
Absolutely. I think one of the most important things to start off with is understanding that anti-Blackness isn't just general racism. It's specifically aimed at Black individuals and Black communities.
Yeah.
And to really understand that, we kind of have to look back in time.
Okay, so let's talk about that history. I mean, we all know that, slavery ended a long time ago, but it's not as easy as just saying, well, that was then, this is now, right?
Exactly. Think of it like this. If you've got a building and the foundation has all these cracks in it, even if you patch them up, the structure is still weakened. And anti-Blackness is kind of like that. It's this weakened foundation impacting everything that gets built on top of it. It didn't magically disappear when slavery ended. Its legacy continues to shape our social structures in really profound ways.
I see what you're saying. So when we talk about anti-Blackness, then what makes that different from racism in a more general sense?
It goes back to that unique historical and social context that specifically impacts Black identities. So we're talking about the transatlantic slave trade, colonization. These practices created a system where Black people were seen as less than human. And echoes of those beliefs, unfortunately, still linger today.
Okay, so yeah, we're seeing how the past is very much present. But, I've always kind of thought about colonialism as this thing that's about, empires and maps and stuff, not necessarily everyday racism. So how does that really connect to what we're talking about here?
Colonialism is actually really deeply intertwined with anti-Blackness.
Yeah.
When European powers colonized Africa, they needed a way to justify why they were doing what they were doing. They were exploiting people. So they created this whole narrative that African cultures and people were primitive or savage. And it wasn't just about, taking their resources. It was about dehumanizing an entire people. And that, sadly, those ideas still echo in some of the stereotypes that we see, even today, even subconsciously.
Wow. So we're not just talking about, these isolated incidents here. We're talking about a system, like a worldwide system that was literally designed to oppress Black people.
Exactly.
And that's been going on for centuries in some form or another.
Exactly. And the consequences of that system are woven into the fabric of our society. We see it in things like redlining, where Black families were systematically denied loans to buy homes. And we see it in the mass incarceration of Black people, which, removes them from their communities, their families, at a much higher rate than any other group. These policies weren't just bad. They were actually built on this long history of anti-Blackness. It's heavy stuff, but I think understanding that context is key to really being able to dismantle it.
Yeah, that's a lot to process. But I think you're right. Understanding the why is so important. So let's get into some of how this historical baggage actually shows up in our everyday lives. Most people aren't, running around owning slaves anymore, or, running colonies. So how is anti-Blackness still happening, How is it rearing its ugly head?
Well, it often operates in very subtle ways. And I think that's why it can be so insidious and hard to pin down. But one of the major ways is through these things called microaggressions. And these are these seemingly small acts. Sometimes they're unintentional, but they communicate hostility and prejudice against Black people.
Okay, I think this is something I really want to dig into a little bit more. Because, I hear this term microaggressions a lot, but I'm not always sure what it actually looks like in real life. Can you give us some concrete examples?
Sure. So imagine, for example, you've got a Black professional in a meeting, and they present this brilliant idea, and then a white colleague repeats the same idea, and suddenly everyone's praising them. Or think about the constant questioning of a Black person's qualifications. While their white counterparts are just automatically assumed to be competent, these are microaggressions. And over time, they chip away at someone's sense of worth and belonging.
Yeah, I can see how that would be incredibly frustrating. And demoralizing. It's not just about being mean, it's about undermining someone because of their race.
Exactly. And often it's so subtle that the person doing it might not even realize the harm they're causing. And then there's the issue of stereotyping, which is just a huge problem. Instead of seeing individuals for who they are, we reduce them to these cliches based on their race.
Right. It's like you're not even seen as a person anymore. You're just a collection of stereotypes. And this is where I think the media comes in too, right? Because the images that we see on screen really can shape how we view the world.
Absolutely. The media often portrays Black people in very narrow and limiting ways. So you see them as criminals, as low income, as dangerous. And these portrayals have a real impact on how Black people are perceived and treated in the real world.
So it's like this vicious cycle, right? These negative portrayals just reinforce those harmful stereotypes.
Exactly.
Which then leads to more discrimination and prejudice. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy almost.
Right. And that's why it's so important to be critical of the media that we consume and to demand more diverse and nuanced representations of Black people.
That's such a good point. We need to be more aware of the messages that we're internalizing and how those messages might be perpetuating harmful stereotypes.
Absolutely.
It's kind of crazy how, those portrayals can stick with us. And I'm thinking about our education system, right? Like, schools are supposed to be these places that are fair and equal. But how does this whole anti-Blackness thing play out when it comes to education?
Unfortunately, schools aren't immune to these deeply rooted biases either. If you think about discipline, for instance, Black students are often punished way more harshly than their white peers for doing the exact same things. And that sends a really powerful message about, who's seen as inherently good or bad.
Yeah, I can see how that would have like a lasting impact on a kid's sense of self-worth, like their belief in their own potential. It's not just about a single incident. It's the effect over time.
Right. Absolutely. And then there's the issue of representation in the curriculum itself.
Yeah.
If the history books mostly focus on like European perspectives and achievements, it kind of subtly reinforces this idea that Black history and contributions are somehow less important.
It's almost like saying, these are the stories that matter. These are the people that really shaped the world. And if you don't see yourself in those stories, it's got to be harder to imagine, achieving great things yourself.
Exactly. And that lack of representation, I think, contributes to what we call the achievement gap. We hear a lot about that. But it's not that Black students are any less capable. It's that they face these systemic barriers that their white peers just don't.
It's like setting them up to fail almost before they even begin.
In a way, yeah. And those barriers extend way beyond education, too. If we want to talk about like the corporate world for a minute, our source really gets into some of the challenges that Black people face in professional settings.
Yeah, I mean, it paints a pretty bleak picture, to be honest. And one of the things that really stood out to me was this whole lack of representation in leadership positions. If you don't see anyone who looks like you at the top, it must be hard to feel like you really belong there.
It definitely sends a message about who is seen as like capable and qualified to lead. And then that lack of representation has ripple effects throughout the whole company culture.
No, totally. And our source also talks about hiring discrimination, which sadly is still a huge problem. It's just mind-boggling to me. That studies still show that resumes with Black-sounding names are less likely to even get a callback, even when the qualifications are identical.
It's such a clear example of how unconscious bias works. People might not even realize they're doing it, but they're making assumptions about someone's competence and worth just based on their name.
Wow. So it's like even getting your foot in the door is harder for Black people. And then once they're in, they often face microaggressions, lack of support, fewer opportunities for advancement. It's a lot.
A constant uphill battle.
Totally.
And this isn't just about fairness. Companies are missing out on so much talent and innovation when they don't create workplaces that are truly inclusive. Diversity isn't just a buzzword. It's essential for success.
So what can companies actually do then to address these issues and create environments that are more inclusive? I mean, it's not enough to just say like, oh, we value diversity and then pat yourself on the back.
They have to be proactive
and
intentional about diversifying their workforce at every single level, from entry-level positions all the way up to the C-suite.
Right, and that means going beyond just hiring practices too, right? It's about creating a culture where everyone feels seen, heard, and respected.
Absolutely. It's about, implementing anti-bias training, holding people accountable for discriminatory behavior, and really actively promoting diversity and inclusion initiatives.
It's like making a real commitment, not just checking boxes.
Exactly.
Yeah. But this work can't just happen within institutions either, right?
Yeah.
Our source also talks about the importance of, like, community resistance and activism in challenging anti-Blackness.
Yes, absolutely. Grassroots movements have always been on the front lines of social change. And that's definitely true when it comes to the fight for racial justice. These movements are often led by the people who are most impacted by these issues. And they're doing the essential work of educating, empowering, and advocating for change.
Can you give us some concrete examples of what that actually looks like on the ground? What are some of the ways these movements are really making a difference?
Sure. So think about, organizations that are providing legal support, to victims of racial discrimination or groups that are pushing for police reform and an end to mass incarceration. You've got communities coming together to support Black-owned businesses, to create safe spaces for Black people to thrive.
It's so inspiring to see people taking action and demanding justice, even when they're facing these huge challenges.
Absolutely. And, social media has also played a really powerful role in amplifying those voices and connecting people across geographic boundaries. Think about movements like #BlackLivesMatter, which has brought global attention to the issue of police brutality and systemic racism. Social media has become this tool for, organizing protests, sharing information, and holding those in power accountable.
It's amazing how technology can be used in the fight for social justice like that.
It really is.
But real change doesn't just happen online, though, right? It has to translate into action in the real world.
Right. Attending protests, contacting your elected officials, having those uncomfortable conversations with friends and family about race and racism. These are all really important forms of activism.
So it's not just about, posting on social media. It's about actually taking action in your community, using your voice to advocate for change.
Exactly. We all have a role to play in this fight, and no action is too small. And part of that work, I think, involves educating ourselves. Our source really emphasizes that. Knowledge is power. The more we understand the history of anti-Blackness, how it operates, and its impact on individuals and communities, the better equipped we are to challenge it.
So it's not just about feeling outraged or sad. It's about understanding the root causes and then taking action to address those causes.
Right. And there's so many resources available to help us learn: books, articles, documentaries, podcasts. The key is to be proactive and seek out information from diverse sources.
Yeah, and we shouldn't be afraid to have those difficult conversations with the people in our lives. It's okay to not have all the answers, but I think the more we talk about these issues, the more awareness we raise, and the closer we get to actually creating real change.
I completely agree. These conversations can be uncomfortable, but they're necessary if we want to move forward. We need to challenge the status quo and hold each other accountable.
I think it's also really important to acknowledge the emotional toll that anti-Blackness takes on Black individuals and communities. I mean, it must be exhausting to constantly have to navigate a world that's not really designed for you, to face microaggressions and discrimination every day.
It is. It's trauma. Generational trauma that's been passed down for centuries.
Wow. And it's essential for allies to be aware of that, to be sensitive to the lived experiences of Black people.
Right. It's not about comparing struggles or trying to one-up each other. It's about recognizing that everyone's experiences are valid, that we need to support each other in this fight.
This has been a really insightful deep dive, but it's also been really emotionally heavy. And I think it's important to maybe end on a note of hope. So what are some of the things that give you hope for the future?
Honestly, I'm constantly inspired by the resilience and strength of Black communities. Despite facing centuries of oppression, they continue to create, innovate, and fight for justice. And seeing the growing number of allies who are stepping up and using their voices to amplify the voices of Black people, that gives me a lot of hope.
Yeah, it feels like we're finally having some real and necessary conversations about race and racism. And that's a sign of progress, I think.
It is. But conversations aren't enough. We need to turn those conversations into action.
Right. So what does that look like? What are some tangible steps that we can take to create a more just future?
Well, we need to vote for policies and candidates that promote racial justice. We need to support organizations that are working to dismantle systems of oppression. And we need to continue educating ourselves and having those difficult conversations.
Yeah, we can't afford to be complacent. This fight against anti-Blackness, it's a marathon, not a sprint.
But I truly believe that together we can create a more just and equitable world for all.
Okay, so we're back. Ready to wrap up this deep dive on anti-Blackness. It's been heavy, but I think really important too. Like, we've gone from, the historical roots of all this to how it's still playing out in so many ways today.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey. I think what's really hit home for me is how deeply ingrained anti-Blackness is in our society. It's woven into our institutions. It operates on this unconscious level often, which makes it even harder to, really combat.
Yeah, it feels like such a huge systemic problem. But before we wrap up, I did want to touch on this. Our source made this point about envisioning a future, like actually envisioning a future without anti-Blackness. Is that even possible?
I know it can seem kind of like a far-off dream, given everything we've talked about, the weight of history, how persistent these issues are. But I think it's really important to hold on to that vision, that a better world is possible.
Yeah, I love that. Like, it's a North Star guiding us towards this future where Black people are truly free and equal, but what would that even look like? Like, what are the steps to get us there?
Well, for one, I think we have to make education a top priority. And I'm not just talking about schools, although that's obviously hugely important. But we need to educate ourselves and each other about the history of anti-Blackness, how it shows up in everyday life, and how we can challenge it.
So we're talking like books, documentaries, having
Yeah.
those tough conversations with people, all that.
Exactly. The more we understand these issues, the more equipped we are to actually dismantle them. And it's not just about gaining knowledge. It's about putting that knowledge into action in our daily lives.
Right, walking the walk, not just talking the talk. What else needs to change for this just future to actually become a reality?
We need systemic change. We need to address the policies and practices that perpetuate inequality, from the criminal justice system to education to the corporate world. It's a long list.
So yeah, things like voting for candidates who support racial justice, pushing for policy changes, holding our leaders accountable. It's all connected.
It really is. But change doesn't just come from the top down. We also need to foster a culture of anti-racism at the community level.
What does that actually look like day to day? How do we build that kind of culture?
It means being willing to challenge, racist jokes or comments, even when it's uncomfortable. It means supporting Black-owned businesses and organizations, creating spaces where Black people genuinely feel safe and valued.
So it's almost like weaving anti-racism into everything we do, making it a part of who we are and how we interact with the world.
That's a great way to put it. Ultimately, it's about creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, regardless of their race. It's a long road ahead, no doubt, but it's a journey worth taking.
Yeah, I totally agree. This deep dive has been challenging, but it's also left me feeling hopeful. Like I'm walking away with a renewed sense of purpose and a commitment to doing my part to actually dismantle anti-Blackness. What about you?
Absolutely. And that's what it's all about. It's a collective effort. And every single one of us has a role to play. There's no action too small. Every conversation, every act of kindness, every time we challenge the status quo, it all adds up.
So to everyone listening out there, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep fighting for justice. Anti-Blackness is a deeply rooted problem, but it's not insurmountable, and together we can create a better future. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.